Powering Canada's Future, What It Will Take to Green and Grow Our Grid. And just for those of you who haven't been involved in too many of our Senators for Climate Solutions events, we do not have them weekly. We just happen to have 2 in a row this month, and we're very fortunate to have those happen. But we can talk about the pacing of our events on another occasion. I'm pleased to be hosting this event alongside our co-chair, Senator Stan Kuchar, and I want to thank all of our staff and our interpreters for your help in making this session happen. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to our new senators who are joining us here today. I'd like to acknowledge that we're having this session on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We're fortunate to have 3 panelists with us today to discuss the greening, the decarbonization of our electricity grid, plus the overall need to significantly expand our electric capacity from where it is today to meet the significantly higher demands of the future. While our electricity systems grow to meet those demands, issues of clean energy supply, reliability, and affordability, of course, are all key matters. We have with us 3 experts who will bring different and important perspectives to our discussion on this very significant transformation. We have with us Carolyn Lee, who's the research lead on mitigation at the Canadian Climate Institute. I was fortunate to meet Carolyn at COP27. Good to see you again, Carolyn. We have also Anthony Haynes, who is the president and CEO of Toronto Hydro. Our retired colleague, Howard Wetston, is on Anthony's board and introduced Stan and I to Anthony last year. And also, thank you so much for getting up early. Dr. Sarah Hastings-Simon is an assistant professor at the University of Calgary. I was just looking at some of your Twitter feed. You are an interesting woman. She is an expert in energy, innovation, and climate policy. And as you all know, our topic today is about all of those subjects. Each panelist will make a brief presentation, and after each one has spoken, after they've all spoken, Senator Kuchar will chair the question and answer period. So we won't be taking questions after each speaker. We'll do the Q&A after each one of them have had a chance to make their introductory remarks. At the bottom right of your Zoom window, you can find the icon that indicates interpretation for those who need it. Please click on that and choose your preferred language. In order to speak during the meeting, you'll require a Senate grade headset, as you know. I want to thank our 3 guests again for joining us today. We're very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say. We've been planning this particular panel for a very long time, and it's something we're very excited about. I'll now turn to our very first panelist, Carolyn Lee. Carolyn, who also has an Antigonish connection. For those of you who don't know, I live in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. Carolyn, could you start us off by speaking about the overall findings of the Canadian Climate Institute's report called The Big Switch, and also touch, if you could, on the topic of electric federalism. Over to you, Carolyn. Thanks for being here.
Thanks very much, Senators. I very much appreciate the invitation to speak here today. Just stand by while my participant screen sharing has been disabled. I do have screens. If it's possible to enable that, that would be great. Otherwise, I can go without screen sharing. That would be fine too. Thank you, Lauren. I'll just get started though. So as Senator Coyle said, I'll talk about some of the work that we released here at the Institute in a report called The Big Switch. This was released just earlier last year on what it takes to align Canada's electricity systems with net zero goals. So I'll structure my presentation, my brief presentation, along basically 2 questions. First of all, what? So what changes need to be brought about in electricity systems to support net zero goals? And the spoiler is right in the title of my presentation, which you can't see, but it says bigger, cleaner, and smarter. So Senator Coyle, you already alluded to the bigger and cleaner. We think smarter is also an important change that needs to be affected. That's the first section. The second section is how. So how to bring these changes about. Okay, thank you, Lauren. Let me try to share my screen here now. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. Um, so moving on to the first section then of my presentation, the what. What changes are needed in Canada's electricity systems to align with net zero? We know this, but I think it's worth repeating. In order to support this widespread electrification that studies consistently are telling us are needed to achieve net zero in Canada, we of course need to grow our supply. So what we find in our work is that the capacity of Canada's electricity systems need to at least double, if not more than triple, by 2050 compared to today. So this is a significant level and rate of growth for the next several decades. So that's bigger. Cleaner. Electricity systems must also get cleaner, as we said. And so this graph here shows you the electricity generation mix across the different studies that we assessed in our work in order to achieve net zero. And I'll go through the three things that need to happen in order to get cleaner. It might be obvious, but I think it is worth reinforcing. One, we need to grow clean sources. And the majority of what is growing in a net zero future in Canada is actually solar, wind, and storage. So we see that the majority of new capacity additions on a path to net zero is from these three sources. Secondly, we have to be phasing out polluting sources. I think that's obvious. We show that unabated fossil fuel generation, so electricity generation coming from fossil fuels that doesn't have CCS equipped to it, drops down to at most 1% across the entire country by 2050. So we mostly are phasing out these types of sources, number two. Number three, it's not just about growing or shrinking certain sources, but I think it's important to recall Canada already has a strong existing base of non-emitting power, namely in the forms of nuclear and hydro. So maintaining this strong base is also really critical. So that's cleaner. Next, smarter. And what I mean by smarter is becoming more flexible, more responsive. And this is important in large part to better accommodate this variable supply that's coming from sources like solar and wind. So we know, yes, the common adage is the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, but these are challenges that can be overcome. There are numerous ways of addressing that variability, that intermittency through technologies and approaches that you see listed around this wheel that are already being adopted around the world today. So yes, it's a challenge, but it can certainly be overcome. So that's the what. Electricity systems need to get bigger, cleaner, and smarter. Now, moving on to how. How do we bring these changes about? I'll go through 4 pretty high level recommendations here. Certainly, if you're interested in digging in deeper, I encourage you to refer to our report in the Big Switch, which provides a much more elaboration on what I'm going to say here. So I've got 4 recommendations here. I'll tie it all up with a 5th on the next slide. The first recommendation here is for the federal government to do away with its current output-based approach to carbon pricing in the electricity system and instead move towards a full carbon pricing approach for that sector, as it does for many other sectors of the economy, to really strengthen the price signal in that sector so electricity generators feel the full price incentive. Number 2, this is a recommendation for all levels of government. We recommend that governments should be using public funds to invest in electricity systems. So we know that currently it's ratepayers that foot the bill for electricity systems investments. But we think there's a strong argument to be made with the electricity system providing such broad public benefit. I mean, the decarbonization of electricity really underpins the achievement of net zero goals in Canada. So we believe that these costs, these investments, should actually be borne in part by society at large, which are taxpayers. The third recommendation here is squarely directed at provincial governments. Now, we know that they have the primary jurisdiction over electricity. Our recommendation here is that they direct their own provincial energy institutions, so for example, energy regulators, to formally pursue net zero goals. So we know that for the most part, emissions reductions are not a part of the formal mandate of these institutions, actually. And yet these institutions, regulators included, their work is really critical for guiding energy investment and decision-making within their borders. So we believe that clarifying net zero goals for these institutions having them develop provincial energy plans will help make sure that really all parties that are making decisions on energy are pointed in that same direction of net zero. And then the fourth recommendation here is that all orders of government should use their respective levers to pursue better coordination and integration of their electricity systems. And we know that when the electricity systems of different regions are better connected, that helps Canada reach its emissions reductions targets at a much lower cost, but it also has important benefits for resilience. So those are the four high-level recommendations. I'm going to tie them all together here with a last fifth recommendation. This is a notion, an idea that we've dubbed electric federalism. And this is an approach that is akin, I think, to the approach Canada has taken on childcare, on healthcare, but applied to electricity, where the federal government would provide financial support for provinces' electricity systems transitions, but that support would be made conditional on provinces meeting certain high-level principles. So those high-level principles would include, as I said before, the need to make changes to the mandates of their key energy institutions for net zero, for instance, of their energy regulators. Secondly, the need for provinces and territories to develop regional energy plans and conduct independent pathway assessments to reach their net zero goals. And then thirdly, to participate in the working groups of, for example, the announced Grid Council that we know is intended to address issues of interregional cooperation and integration. So, oops, I apologize. I skipped too quickly. I think the important reason for proposing this is that this federal support would help with the significant cost of electricity system investments. We know that it's going to cost money, but in particular, this federal support could help temper that risk of rising electricity rates. I mean, that we know is a major barrier to accelerating the investments needed in transitioning electricity systems. But importantly, these conditions for provinces, they wouldn't be prescriptive. So they would allow provinces to maintain and retain their autonomy and jurisdiction over how they themselves move towards this net zero goal. But there would be some assurance that provinces were making some key changes that would support this net zero transition. So that concludes my presentation. I appreciate the attention. Again, the report is called The Big Switch. Feel free to consult it on our website, and happy to take questions at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. There's a lot packed into that, and thank you for being so concise and really providing us with a lot of food for thought there. We will certainly share your deck, if you don't mind sharing it with us. We'll definitely distribute that to all of our members, not all of whom are on here, but certainly our participants today and others. And we'll also share the report, the Big Switch report that came out of the Climate Institute. It's an excellent report, and I highly recommend it. So you've really got us started there, and our other panelists may, in fact, now that they see what you've presented, may want to comment on that as well. Anthony, we're now about to turn things over to you, and you've been working, I remember from our conversations in the international energy industry for a very long time. And at a practical level, you run a very large utility, Toronto Hydro. So we'd like to hear from you what your observations are on this global energy shift, because this isn't just happening in Canada. I mean, we're talking about Canada, but there's also opportunities for Canada, beyond our own borders in this energy shift as well. But let's hear where we sit within that global energy shift, and also very practically, what's the story on the ground at Toronto Hydro? What are you doing in the context of that shift? How do you see it? What are the practical implications for your business, the challenges, the opportunities, the timelines, and advice that you might have for policymakers? And I thank Carolyn for providing us with that as well. So Anthony, thanks for being with us. Over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Look, much of what I was going to say supports what Carolyn has already said. Sorry. So disappointment. We're not going to have a controversial view from me this morning. In fact, it'll be a supportive view, but it'll be perhaps a little more from the front line. First of all, let me just thank you for having me this morning. And obviously it goes without saying that it's an honor to be with you, but it's also a passion of mine to be with you. I would say a couple of maybe slightly controversial things. You know, we all look at this 1.5 degrees as the goal, you know, when we really don't have a plan today, not to stop ourselves from going well past 1.5 degrees. That's my first observation. Second observation is most plans that I see coming out of governments are more aspirations than plans. And I think your title says it today. What's it going to take to convert this aspiration into a real plan that can be achieved? So I'm deeply honored to be a part of that conversation. So let's break down a little what Carolyn was talking to us about. When we think about greenhouse gases, we know that 1/3 come from the heating and industries. We know that 1/3 come from vehicles, transportation, and 1/3 come from a whole myriad of other things. So when we think about the switching, each one of those pieces of the pie have a completely different attribute. And I think at some point, not enough time today, but at some point we should be talking about, are we going to move on all of them simultaneously? Are there some that have different economic impacts? They all have different, very different impacts on the grid. So a topic for another day, for sure. Let me talk to you a little bit about Ontario today. Ontario's market today from generation to meter is about a $20 billion budget when we take all the pieces and add them up together. And Carolyn talked about, in fact, the concept of subsidy coming from government. Well, that exists in Ontario today. In fact, as we moved away from coal generation, that resulted in a high rate impacts that couldn't be politically sustained. And so today the government supports about $8 billion out of taxpayers' money for that grid. And so really, if you look at the gross cost of the grid today in Ontario, it's about $28 billion. The demand, when we think about Toronto, Toronto is the fastest growing city in North America. Just sort of side point for you. If you add up New York, Chicago, LA, and half a dozen other cities, they are, in fact, cumulatively are less than the growth that's going on in Toronto. So it's an interesting a platform for us to look at how can you support this kind of demand growth. And up till now, most of that has been supported through conservation and regulations. In other words, the envelope of the building, the equipment within it, and the use of energy more efficiently has been able to sustain that kind of a growth without big scale generation add. I agree with Carolyn. Most energy leaders, as I talk to them around the world, agree that this is a 2 to 3 times capacity challenge. So where's it going to come from in Ontario? That's the big question. This will be a bit unpopular for some. It's going to come from mostly centralized sources. And in Ontario's case, given our fuel choices, it will probably come from nuclear generation. Many think that they can be achieved through small-scale grid-based, and that will be part of the solution for sure, and could come from conservation. Are we using energy optimally today? No, there can be some opportunities there, but let me give you my sense of what the pie might look like in order to meet this capacity in the future. I think it'll be about 70%, 70% from large-scale centralized generation, 20% from regional generation, and then about 10% from conservation. That's my view of how the supply will be met. Today, Ontario is one of the cleanest grids in the world, 93%. Here's the sad truth, we're going backwards. So as the demand begins, we're actually going to take GHG out behind the meter and we're going to add it in up at the other end of the grid. So in the government's plans right now are to actually move towards about a 70% carbon free, so a drop of 20%. I think that'll be the big challenge for everybody. So the real question that we're all suffering with is at what pace? You don't want to build before it's needed because that's obviously inefficient, and you can't build after. You have this obligation to serve. And when we think about the way a grid grows, it's the skeleton gets built before everything else. And so the big dollars are spent very early in the cycle. I'm going to propose to you that coming out of COVID, The pace of this is not going to be based on demand. It'll be based on supply. The industry is suffering with supply chain challenges globally. There is simply not enough materials. You may be shocked to find out today that I can't buy a transformer that those little gray cans that sit on top of poles, you can't find them in the world. So before we even start talking about adding capacity, we have a serious supply chain from both materials and labor. And so I propose that that will be the determinant of the pace. We've looked at the cost of all of this. Carolyn raised this question about price. Our best estimates are that generation in Ontario will need about a $500 billion build out. And then the wires from the transmission through the distribution are a couple $100 billion, with about $300 billion in behind the meter on equipment conversions. And so when you add all that up, it looks like about $1 trillion budget to achieve these objectives. And so that $20 billion industry grows to something between 70 and 100 billion as we move through that cycle. And this is where I tend to lose the politicians in the room. That will drive rates of electricity to increase about 10 to 20% a year. Okay, so whoever's on the floor, I apologize. It will drive 10 to 20% a year. And in my observation, the great fallacy here is that this implies that there's a choice. I come back to the 1.5% and I say, there's actually not a choice. We're not, we will simply have to add up the cost of this towards the end, but there is not a question of whether we can or can't. So we have to accept that that is the pressure that's going to be on the ratepayers in the early parts of this build out. And so what do we do about that? Obviously, that's politically unacceptable. I would say, again, maybe for another day or maybe even in question period later on here. I've seen this before. I was involved with a project out on Vancouver Island to take oil out of the industry, the pulp and paper industry, and people's basements, et cetera. And so I've sort of done this before 30 years ago, and we found some unique ways to deal with that problem. And so in my mind, that was a precursor, a warm-up to what we can do about this going forward. So you've asked a little about maybe from the front lines, what's Toronto Hydro been up to and where do we go from here? The first thing I would say is we need to harden the system. Those in Ottawa would agree with that. As storms go through, they have massive impacts on the grid. We've been doing that in Toronto. There's a lot of technology, hardened, what they call tree cable that can withstand trees falling, and decouplers that pull the system apart when a heavy object falls on it. So we've been doing that for quite some time, and we're certainly seeing the benefit of that. Carolyn talked about the intelligent grid. We've been building sensors in for about a decade. It is critical to that new grid and its capacity to meet these needs. I'll give you sort of my old world analogy of this. Today in Toronto Hydro's grid, we will collect about 2,000 phone books of data. That's my analogy, is the old phone book. Remember those things we used to get dropped off on the steps? About 2,000 of those, or 2 terabytes, will get put into our systems out of this intelligent grid that exists today in Toronto. And all that data gets converted into information, and information gets converted into decision making. And so a critical part of the system is to have that nerve center pulsing away every day in every way, so that you know what's happening in every corner. Today, we've added about 2,000 generators onto the grid. One of the things that, again, Carolyn said, and I can support, is we've added large-scale storage onto the system. So we're seeing what storage looks like on the grid and the attributes and the benefits associated with it. So where do we go from here? Very quickly, I think the plan for Ontario that I've spoken about publicly is that we need a plan. It may seem astonishing to you, but today we effectively have no plan in Ontario. So we need a comprehensive plan that all the players can rally around. And so we're working on that. We need a supply chain strategy that doesn't add carbon to the grid. Here's a big one that you may be interested in. We need a regulatory system that can allow for this uncertainty. Today, the regulatory system has very sort of, rigorous process around forecasting and challenging, et cetera. That's all good. But what do you do in a world where the pace will be unknown? Well, again, there are mechanisms around that, but you need to protect both the customers and the shareholders from that uncertainty. And so we need to build this regulatory system that will allow for this conversion. Obviously, we've got to build the capacity to both build on the grid side and the conversion side. And then we've got to agree on a rate relief plan. If we don't agree on the rate relief plan at the front of the journey, we can almost guarantee ourselves a panic and basically the button of ejecting the proposal as we move through. So that's where I see us going from here. Perhaps we'll stop at this point and take questions a little later on. So thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Anthony. So much there actually packed into those few minutes, and so much to unpack further with you. These issues of the supply chain, things that we don't, simple things, right? But huge things that we don't even think about. We know we need a reliable grid for the future, and we do not want energy poverty, which you've talked about. There's so much there. So we will. I won't get into it. I will move on to our next speaker now, and introduce Sarah, and then we'll get down to the questions. Thank you. So Sarah, welcome. We're hoping that you will now talk with us about, from your perspective, about the opportunities and challenges facing this transition to a decarbonized energy system in Canada. And feel free to make special mention of the province of Alberta. And as others have been doing, if you have any advice and roles that you think policymakers can play in supporting this transition, we'd love to hear that as well. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I think Caroline did a really wonderful job of setting up the challenge, so I won't spend a lot of time on that, but I'll just add a perspective on the growth that's required. That doubling or whatever it ends up being exactly is a significant growth, but it's something that Canada has done before. We're talking about an annual growth rate in the range of 2 to 3%, where we saw growth in electricity demand from the period of 1960 to 1990 of almost 5%. And so I think that's important to keep in mind when we scale that challenge. We've been quite successful actually at reducing our demand growth over the past few decades because of advances in energy efficiency, lighting being one major one. And I think that sometimes covers up the fact that this is a growth challenge that we have met before. So I think there is that opportunity there. Of course, the decarbonization challenge looks very different depending on where you sit in the country. And myself being in Alberta in a grid that is very fossil fuel heavy with a very limited amounts of hydro resources, there is, we have made less progress, of course, than other regions, and there are some challenges that lay ahead. And I want to talk through what those are and what some of the solutions might be. So we have the situation that we're in today. We have, again, some opportunities. Some of the facts are on our side in terms of the fact that we're now at a point where bulk energy from renewable resources like wind and solar is cost competitive, and in some cases even cost less than other energy sources such as historical fossil resources. And that's really a global phenomenon. As we've seen more wind and solar deployed around the world, the costs of those technologies have come down, and we can benefit from that in Canada. Of course, as Caroline also mentioned, there is the challenge of availability of these variable resources. And so while the the energy that they provide can be very affordable. The need to have that energy available 24/7, of course, is one of the major challenges. And on that, I think it's really important to divide that challenge into two parts, because of course the challenge of powering a grid, for example, in Alberta with 100% non-emitting energy is quite difficult. But the hard part of that challenge really is the last 10% or so of the energy that you need to generate. And in fact, the first 70 to 80 and even upwards of 90, depending on the integration of some storage, is actually quite achievable. And so some research that I'm working on right now is looking at how much of our energy demand can we meet on an hourly basis. So of course, the challenge that wind and solar is not always available. And what we find is that you can get up to 75% of the annual energy demand from these resources, really without even the integration of much storage at all from a bulk energy perspective. Of course, as that number increases, storage becomes more valuable as a way to help to lower the cost of needing to build a lot more new wind and solar. But I think that that's also quite important, because it sort of sets up two challenges that we really have today. One is to actually continue in the case of Alberta and sort of start in the case of provinces like Saskatchewan to really move aggressively on installation of wind and solar resources today. That's a huge opportunity. It creates jobs, it creates revenues for local municipalities. But we need to move more quickly there. At the same time, we do need to work on those solutions for that last 10, 20%. But we shouldn't let that sort of stop us from moving ahead on the first part today. When it comes to that last 20% of decarbonization that is more challenging, again, there we know the types of solutions that we need to implement, and those are, I think, well described in the Big Switch report that Caroline spoke to. They include, of course, things like storage, demand response, as well as connections between provinces. And of course, the fact that most of our provinces across Alberta that have limited hydro resources are actually very, very close or next to a province with a significant hydro resource. And so building out interprovincial transmission between those regions is one important solution. When it comes to what government, and in particular what the federal government can do along these dimensions, on this first part of really accelerating the build out of these non-emitting renewable sources in historically fossil fuel heavy provinces, one of the biggest tools I think to start with is really the funding of transmission lines. So this is not infrastructure connecting between provinces, but within provinces. And historically, the way that we decide to plan and build these transmission lines is based on project need. So when we identify that there's a proponent that wants to build a project in a certain pace, we build the transmission lines. And this does not work well in the case of renewable energy and at the pace of development that we need in order to meet our 2035 clean energy target. And so flipping that on its head in I like to call it, a build it and they will come approach that has worked in other regions, like Texas, for example. They identified areas where they had significant renewable resources, and as Caroline mentioned, used government funding to build out transmission lines, and then in fact did see significant renewable energy development coming in once those connection points were available. So of course that takes money, but I think that's something that the federal government could do to support Alberta in meeting the 2035 clean energy target. Beyond that, then money and support to create transmission lines between provinces, of course, is another area. And there's both the technical challenges, but honestly, one of the biggest challenges is really the distributional impacts and the winners and losers when it comes to the generators today. So support for those transmission line build-outs, but really working through the challenges of which generators today would actually be disadvantaged by those transmission lines being built between, for example, Alberta and BC, and looking for ways to come up with a fair solution that allows those projects to proceed, can benefit everybody. So I think I'll stop my remarks there, and I look forward to discussing further in questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to each of our presenters. I think we could have had each one of you for like a whole half day and still not picked your brains sufficiently for us as policymakers to really get the much better understanding we need. But thank you for what you've done. We'll start with Senator Sorensen first, and then depending on Senator Quinn's timeline, Senator Quinn, and then I have a bunch that other people have sent me. So please go ahead, Karen.
Thank you. First, I have to give a shout out to Sarah's art. I'm a senator from Alberta, and while I live in the middle of the Canadian Rockies, that little prairie dog there is they're very pertinent in Banff and area in the national park as well. So thanks for that. I want to talk about funding and how all this is going to get paid for. And Carolyn's presentation certainly prompted my question, but I'm sure that any one of you would have comments. So I'm a past municipal politician, and while I certainly agree that this is a society-wide urgent matter, there are really only so many tax dollars to go around until the taxpayer starts saying enough, or I suppose as Anthony mentioned, the users as well. That being said, user fees are often used because there's just such demand for the tax dollars, as we're all well aware is the current situation. So I kind of want to talk about, maybe brainstorm, all of you can give me your 2 cents on incentivizing good behavior and penalizing bad behavior. And I know, Caroline, you made references to quite a few incentives, and I think incentivizing good behavior is a great way to go, but those funds have to come from somewhere as well. So is there a way to, and when I say bad behavior, I don't even know what I mean by that, but is there a way to penalize bad behavior and those funds be used to incentivize good behavior? On the other hand, hopefully we run out of bad behavior and we still may need to incentivize good behavior. So I'll start with Carolyn because it was her comments that inspired the question, but if we have time, just a couple of comments from the others would be great.
I appreciate the question. Thank you. I mean, that's the fundamental approach, or that's the theory behind carbon pricing and the carbon tax, is that you want to create a disincentive for behavior that you don't like, that creates carbon pollution. And as a result, if you conduct clean behavior, then you benefit by not having to pay the tax. And so you could, for example, transfer theoretically the money that you get from the bad behavior to the people that are doing the good behavior. What we're talking about in the big switch, in particular around that first recommendation of changing this output-based carbon approach in the electricity system, kind of gets at what you're saying, I think, is that currently, the output-based approach in electricity is complicated enough, but suffice to say that producers in the electricity system, they don't face the full price incentive for all of their generation. And that's...
The interpreter would like to note that service has been interrupted because participants are not on mute.
A little bit of, let's say, buffer because of fears of competitiveness concerns. So this is actually tailored specifically for industries that might lose because of international competitiveness. But actually, in Canada, not much of our electricity is subject to those concerns. And so that's part of the why we think actually put the full price incentive on electricity generators in that system, and then you can disincentivize the bad behavior, which is emitting greenhouse gas pollution through fossil fuels. And then also at the same time, producers of clean electricity can also benefit. So, that's one reason why we made that recommendation. But I'm sure the other panelists have other things to say.
Perhaps sort of staying in the same order, I'll just add a couple of things. What you're asking about is price elasticity, effectively, is what price do we have to have an essential service put at in order to drive the right behaviors. And in Ontario, we've been on time of use rates. And so
The sound quality coming from the current speaker is not sufficient for interpretation to be provided. Interpretation will resume as soon as the sound quality allows it.
What we've learned out of all of that is you need roughly a doubling of the price from during the period that you want to move the demand, in other words, change the behavior to the low rate when you want people to move to. And so we have some sense of what price elasticity looks like in an essential service. And so maybe that starts to guide some of our thinking about fuel switching and other things. And I'm going to just add 2 more points. One of the challenges I've made to our governments at different levels, both municipal and provincial, is it seems ironic to me that the City of Toronto has a plan for net zero, which includes no natural gas in buildings. And they've had that plan while they've approved 500 new buildings that exceed 50 stories high. So when politicians are getting serious, when they stop approving buildings that are getting permitted with natural gas heating, the very thing that they say they want to move away from. And so the first level of this stop bad behaviors is we got to stop approving things that are inconsistent with our plan. The second thing I would say is I think we should begin to look at things like gasoline engine advertising the same way that we looked at tobacco sales 30 years ago. We decided that we were going to prevent the new sort of stream of cigarette smokers by taking away the sort of sexy imaging and advertising, and we were going to put the realities of what that product is. How's a gasoline engine any different? Maybe this is big and bold, but maybe things like gasoline advertising, the sports car racing through the mountain, building that new generation of gasoline engine user should be in fact seen as a product we no longer want to support. On the incentive side, maybe we'll come back to this when I give you my Vancouver Island experience, but I think that we should decouple the cost of electricity at the meter in order to shape the demand. So what I mean by decouple is right now, if you incur $1, you recover $1. When I say decouple, is let's go through a period of decoupling where we actually drive price such that it drives the demand for change so that people can actually predict the value of the conversion and actually receive a reasonable payback on those dollars. Anyway, those are a couple of quick comments.
I'll just add a couple of observations, perhaps around specifically the area that I was talking about, the funding of transmission lines within the province. And I think there, certainly the magnitude of the funds, especially on a Canadian scale, is actually relatively limited. The challenge is more, I think, in twofold. So one is the process that we have for getting transmission lines built, which I think would be difficult to change, really doesn't allow us to make those investments at the pace needed. And so having direct funding is one kind of workaround of there. The other is really more of a maybe political challenge at the provincial level, where we know that people are very sensitive to these changing rates on their electricity bills in a way that is not necessarily the scale of that change. They're more responsive to it than seeing that change coming through elsewhere on taxes or otherwise. And so because building out transmission lines and then ultimately bringing in lower costs of generation can actually result in a lower cost system overall, there is, in principle, the money is sort of there if you do the math of the system we have today and one that had much more transmission and more renewables, but there are barriers to getting from point A to point B. And so providing that funding specifically in that case, I think, can be a good solution.
Sorry, my computer screen just went wonky, but here we are. Oh, there it came back. Amazing. I have a composite of 3 questions that were suggested, and then if we have time, I'll go to some that Senator Quinn put in. Fascinating challenges here, certainly for policymakers, to try to implement what you have all talked about, and we recognize the necessity of doing that. You've all talked about how important public investment is going to be. Mr. Haynes suggested something around $1 trillion. I have absolutely, frankly, no idea how much $1 trillion is. I know what $10 is, and I know what $50 is, but I have absolutely no idea what $1 trillion is. And when I hear people talking about a 10 to 20% increase in pricing, I know what response that will get. So in public investment, we can either raise taxes or we can reallocate existing funds. So that's pretty well basically the ways that we can do it, or we can, do bonds and all that kind of stuff. So this kind of spending and this kind of investment is going to really require public support in big time. It's going to, people are going to be asked to spend on this. It will really require public support. And we've just gone through COVID, and we've seen how a lack of public understanding of basic science and a lack of understanding of health and healthcare has really got in the way of a good, robust public health response. So I have 3 questions arising from that. One is, what kinds of messaging or what other kinds of things need to be done? And Anthony came up with some really interesting ones on gas engines to ensure that we actually get public support. What has to be in the messaging, who has to be reached, and how can we pair knowledge and understanding with changes in behavior? That's the big issue. You have to change behavior. The second question is, what role would public-private partnerships have in something like this? The National Railway was built on a public-private partnership. This may be the metaphor for this day. And if it does have a role, how would that look like? And then the third and final and more, maybe most challenging question is, we are increasingly living in a polarized political landscape. And how are we going to deal with the challenges that polarized political landscape is giving us just at the time that we need to come together, make these huge investments, and move forward? So there you go, 3 simple questions. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Shall I fools go in where angels fare? Maybe I'll take a quick swag at a few of these. First of all, the messaging. I made the point earlier that the beginning of our messaging has to be that this isn't a choice. That the world cannot sustain 2+ degrees, and therefore what we have to talk about is the how, not the if. So that would be one point. What I will encourage you with is that as we do our some of our customer feedback loops, when we go through the rate making process, what we find is it takes a little while to get the general customer mix to understand. But once they understand, they actually buy into a degree of rate increase when they understand where it's going and the value for it and the offsets. And so there is hope there that we actually aren't heading down a journey that simply can't be achieved. And so there, without a doubt, I said earlier that we need to have this conversation at the beginning of the journey, not when the panic button is about to get pushed. Regarding the how that you asked about, Toronto Hydro as an example, we contract out around 90% of our construction today, 90. So in essence, we are already there. Why do you do these things? Well, they bring capital and they bring skills and efficiencies, and so we're already doing that. And I think that will be the model of how the actual build happens. It's not going to be utilities are going to start ramping up, massive amounts of new resources per se. So that's a little about the how. The final thing that we haven't talked about yet, and maybe again a little bit of hope on the horizon, is when you look at this model that's priced out over a period of time, the problem you have is a reasonably short period of time problem, about 20 years, where the investments are going in and the revenue isn't coming yet. But optimistically, as the revenue comes, you actually see rates lowered. So it goes through a curve, so that in fact the additional revenues that come on from these heating and transportation volumes actually contribute to a lowering of the bill over time. But here's the last political message I would suggest. This is not about the rate of electricity. This is about the cost of energy to a household or a business. So while your electricity bill went up, your gasoline bill went down. And in fact, what we see right now is that, say, in an EV situation where a car is gasoline today and they convert to electricity to an EV, your household spend actually goes down to the point where you're almost halving your cost of electricity. It sort of sounds, unbelievable, but it is. You save about $2,000 a year in gasoline. Your average bill in a residential home in Toronto is $150 a month. And so our messaging has got to be about the cost of energy, the cost of lifestyle, and not the cost of electricity specifically. Anyway, a couple of thoughts.
I'll add just a couple from my side. So again, in Alberta, obviously we have a different situation with a deregulated electricity market, and we have seen significant private investment. Over $4 billion in the last few years has been committed or spent to develop new renewable energy projects from the private sector that have been enabled by having those transmission line connections available, places that you can connect in. So there is actually a real opportunity here as long as the kind of underlying infrastructure is made available. There is a lot also that can be done to reduce costs by working on the demand side of the electricity system. And Caroline mentioned this, of course, in her comments, but this requires a new way of interacting with customers. I think it's very much on the provincial side, but my colleague at the university, Dr. Blake Schaefer, has some really interesting experiments in the field with utility consumers that show that there is quite a lot of flexible demand, and particularly as transportation is electrified, that grows that opportunity, and that flexible demand can help to keep costs low across the system by basically reducing the most expensive hours of production, if you want. And so pursuing those opportunities, I think, is quite important to keep costs low through the transition. And then the last point that I will make is just that when thinking about issues of affordability, I think it's really important to view this through a distributional lens, because there will be people that, as Anthony said, benefit, and as they're making that transition to EVs, but not everybody will be able to do that in the near term. And so I think a big role for the policymakers there is not necessarily to lower costs across the board, but really to make sure that those for whom energy would be otherwise unaffordable are supported through that transition.
And I'll be brief here, but I'll complement the responses of my other colleagues here. One, and let me bundle my response to your first and your third questions here. How to get public support, what's the messaging that we need to use, and then how do we sort of cut through the political polarization of some of these issues? I think the answer can be very similar. So on the affordability question, I very much agree with Anthony that we have to not forget the other side of the ledger, where we might be spending more on electricity, but we're saving a lot on fossil fuels when we're not burning them. We're saving also on the volatility of fossil fuels. So it's not just the price, but it's a very unpredictable price given geopolitical risk. We know that right now. So there are other benefits of weaning ourselves off fossil fuels that we need to be talking about. So that's on the affordability. And actually we show quantitatively that on average, Canadians will actually spend a smaller share of their income on energy in a net zero world, in large part because of the reduced expenditures on fossil fuels. So we have the numbers to actually back up what Anthony has said. Secondly, I think there's a strong argument to be made on sort of international competitiveness of acting here on electricity. Canada already we're ahead on having a clean electricity grid. So that's a really good thing. We see our neighbors to our south already, through the Inflation Reduction Act and other bills that they've implemented, accelerating this push towards clean energy and a clean energy future. Canada failing to invest in our electricity systems, to growing them, to attracting the industries that increasingly are interested in having clean energy supply, is simply going to hurt our competitiveness. Even if you don't care about climate change, I can care about climate change very deeply. Failing to invest in electricity systems, I think, results in material losses in international competitiveness for Canadian industries. And I think that is something that should resonate across all kind of political aisles.
Thank you very much for those erudite and gentle responses. Very, very appreciated. As I was listening to you to speak, I thought, geez, we've got to get all these three people in front of the communications groups here on the Hill, because you've come up with some absolutely significant things, but we need that communication to prepare the public before we go into all these things, for sure. Listen, we've of course run out of time. There are a number of questions on nuclear energy and some on provincial federal transmission and lines and all those other really important things, but maybe we can have another session on nuclear energy for the people that have asked about that. And I just, we need to conclude. And at first, before we stop, I would like to express deep thanks to Sarah Marquis, who is a staff member of our Center for Climate Solutions team. She works in Mary's office, and she's leaving us at the end of this month to focus on her PhD studies. So, bon chance to Sarah. All those people who have their PhDs know what kind of a road that is to hoe. Those people who have been fortunate enough, like myself, to have PhD students know what kind of road that is to hoe. So Sarah, you're going to be awesome. We are so grateful for everything that you've done, and we just wouldn't be able to do any of this without you. Sarah, I see you've typed in. I'm going to embarrass you a little bit. Can you put your video on, and so we can all see you and we can wave to you? There she is. Thank you so much. Awesome, Sarah. You've been outstanding, and thank you. And when you've got that PhD, come back and just overwhelm us with your brilliance again. All right, that would be fantastic. So listen, on behalf of Senator Coyle and myself, I want to just close this session with tremendous thanks to our presenters. Maybe, Mary, we could have each one of these people back for like 6 days each by themselves, because I've learned so much, and yet one of the most important thing I've learned today is that there's so much more that I just have absolutely need to learn about. Okay, so it's like licking the icing off the cake, but we have to have the whole thing. So thank you, every single person. Thank you all for being here, and we'll see you all in the chamber soon. Thanks again. Thanks you, everybody.